My name is Eleni, and it's really an honor to share my strategies for reducing power struggles with families. I really hope some of what I share tonight speaks with you and it can contribute to a more peaceful household. We have about an hour together, a little bit less, so I'm going to pack in quite a bit. This session is not meant to teach you everything you need to know about every strategy. It's meant to give you ideas to reflect on. We don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. So I'm going to give you a lot to think about. I'm going to do that by sharing a little bit about me, and then I want to learn about you. I'm going to give you a framework for prioritizing what matters to you through backwards design. I'm going to offer you some proactive strategies to avoid power struggles and unwanted behaviors. And then we'll talk about problem solving when things don't go as you had hoped. And lastly, we're going to talk about healing, because raising children is really hard work and no one gets out of these years completely unscathed. I'm going to share a lot of resources with you throughout. These are things that I find really helpful and kind of have helped shape my philosophy. I encourage you to follow up with them yourselves if you're interested, but you don't have to write down all the resources or be worried about catching everything I say. I'm going to drop a link in the chat that has all of the information, the authors, the websites laid out for you, so you can kind of just focus in and listen. A little about me. As I said, my name's Eleni, and I'm the founder of a consulting company. It's called Theory and Practice. I work with districts, schools, and families to design solutions that are centered around what's best for the children while supporting the needs of the whole ecosystem, which includes the adults. Everything I do is research-based, but it's also really driven by the realities of daily practice. I have a lot of love and compassion for parents and educators. I'm a parent and educator, and I know how hard both of those roles are. For many, many years, I was the middle school principal and then the associate head of school at the Gateway School, which is an independent school in New York City, specifically for children with language-based learning disabilities and ADHD. I also have expertise in gifted education. I really love curriculum and instruction and adult learning and education. I'm the threest of young siblings. I'm a first-generation American. I'm a first-generation high school grad and a first-generation university graduate. So I also have a lot of love and compassion for parents who might be figuring out how to do things differently than how they were raised. So throughout this session, I'm going to talk about my kids. And when I say my kids, I mean children that I supported as a teacher in school, kids I've worked with consulting, as well as my own children who you see pictured here. My kids are 6 and 9, and I chose this photo for you, not because of their adorable matching outfits, although I do love family matching, and not because this picture was captured by a professional photographer, though you're going to learn tonight that I do love family photo shoots. I chose it because it exemplifies a big theme of the talk tonight, and that is that the path to peace in your household is really mostly about the adults changing their behaviors. Oops, I keep getting this in the way. There we go. This picture was not meant to be a candid photo. You might notice that my son is looking off into the distance. There were hundreds of photos taken this day, and only a handful of times did this child comply with my very, very deep will and desire to make any semblance of a normal face. He was willing to make a normal face and look off into the distance, or make a ridiculous face and look right into the camera, but he could not bring himself to consistently do the one thing that I wanted him to do more than anything. And I did try to bribe him with snacks, with things. I was doing all the things that we do as parents. I just wanted him to pose for a decent family picture. So please don't go into this talk thinking I always get my kids to do what I want them to do. That's not what this is about. This talk is really about leaning into the realities of children and childhood and resisting the urge to escalate small things into larger things. So enough about me. If you could be so kind, please drop the ages of your children into the chat. I'd really like to get a sense of how old the kids are, who you're thinking about. Also, if there's anything burning in your heart that brought you here tonight, you can share that in the chat as well. You really don't have to, but I welcome that. Andrea and Ellen, I think, are going to keep an eye on the chat. So as Ellen mentioned, if there's anything super important that they think I need to address in the moment, they'll let me know. If there's anything that we'll hold for the end. And I also think maybe Rachel will be responding to any quick and easy questions in the chat. So we'll try to talk through the chat. This format is tough for me because I really like to connect. And even though I can't kind of get to know you all, one thing I do know is that if you've joined tonight, it's because you're aware as parents that we all need help. And success, I think, starts when you realize that we all need help, we all need to keep learning. And I think that's especially true for parents of children with ADHD. Your child with ADHD might need more support. And so as a parent, you might need more support. That doesn't make her any less. You know, there are real strengths and power in the ADHD brain, as I'm sure you're all aware. But I also hope that you're aware that your kid is really lucky to have you as their grown up, someone who is continuing to seek support and solutions in raising them. So keep reaching out to those resources. Bergen Chat, it sounds like, has some really incredible support groups. That's, you know, you're in the right place. And again, if I can contribute in any way to improving the experience you're having at home with your kids, it's really an honor and a privilege. To get started in moving from power struggles to problem solving, I'm going to ask you to practice backwards design. In education, anytime we plan a curriculum or a unit or a lesson, we always start with the end in mind. What do we want the child to learn? And then we plan it backwards. So I want you to picture your child as a young adult. What are your hopes and dreams for them? When you imagine them, what kind of traits or experiences or behaviors do you imagine? Can you write it down for yourself in a sentence or two? You can also add it to the chat if you feel comfortable, but you really don't need to. What I want you to do, though, is just hang on to this and keep thinking about it after tonight, because any big picture goal you have for your child is really something you should nurture all the way through their childhood. I like to think of it sort of as a syllabus for childhood. You can't teach your kid everything. You can't give them every experience. So you have to think about who you want them to be, what matters to you as a family, and then prioritize experiences and expectations related to those outcomes. One example I'll very humbly give is many parents ask for guidance on how to instill a love of reading in their child. I think it's a really noble dream, might not be realistic for every kid, but if you want to instill a love of reading in your child, it's something that you have to kind of model and nurture over their entire childhood. And forcing your child to read while you make dinner or scroll on your phone is not going to help them love reading. And as a reading expert, I say this from experience, because I've done this as a parent. I had a kid who was a voracious reader, and then I started using reading as the way to kind of get my quiet time at nighttime and send her off to her room to go do her nightly reading. And she really started disliking reading. And when I analyzed the situation, I noticed like I had gotten busy and stressy. I was using her nightly reading time as a way to get a minute to myself. And that didn't have a positive effect on her relationship with reading. I had to do a makeover on how I handled reading. It took several months. We're back on track. But again, I say zero shame. Like, you know, we make these mistakes as parents and it's okay. We have to learn from these mistakes. I had a kid who was pre-programmed to love reading. I think I unprogrammed her for a little bit. The choices we make as parents really do matter. As I paused and I thought about it, I went back to what do I know about creating a love of reading? Let's make that the experience. So, you know, taking her to the library, reading together, talking about books, listening to the book she's interested, not dictating whether a book is a, you know, good enough quality book for her to read. These are the things that, you know, instill that love and that passion of reading. So whether you realize it or not, your expectations for your children and the experiences you create for them, it's setting them on a path. It's not always the path you want, and we can course correct, but whenever possible, it's really important to try to be intentional and plan with a goal in mind. And now, if you have that big picture dream, let's zoom in and think about some expectations you have for your child now. Maybe you join this talk tonight because there's some challenging issue you're trying to troubleshoot. You can drop that in the chat also if you'd like. But before you do, I do want to say that things like listening, asking for help, and doing what I say, these are not expectations. Expectations are like goals. They have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable, they have to be relevant, and they should really be time bound. I'm not saying you have to have like a corporate retreat every time you go through expectations with your child, but saying you want your kid to listen to you when you speak to them is not specific enough, and I don't think it's achievable. I don't listen every time my child or spouse speaks to me. I don't really think it's a realistic expectation for kids. So, as you're thinking about the here and now and the things that you want to troubleshoot, make sure you know what you're really looking for. If you don't know what you want your child to do, I am sure your child does not know. And that sounds sort of silly, but if we break down when, kids are not meeting our expectations, a lot of times I think we can notice that maybe they weren't very clear. So try to use SMART goals as an example when you're thinking about that backwards design. One thinker, oh yes, Ellen, please. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, hi. So someone wrote, hard thing is that no does not mean no, and will not, I guess the kid will not stop. So I'm bringing it up now because you are talking about goals and looking to the future, and I thought maybe address that either now or maybe that's going to come up later in the talk.
Super helpful. And that's really related actually to what I just said. So I'm glad you brought it up because sometimes like stop what you're doing, that's also not an expectation. And we're going to get to this in just a minute, but this idea that the behaviors that you don't want are actually way downstream after your kid has already failed to meet the expectation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about expectations, then I think we'll jump into that. But Miriam, if I don't get to that and it still doesn't feel like it resonates with you, make sure to, comment again in the chat. One thinker who I really like for thinking about this model is Greene. He's very explicit about expectations. He's an American clinical child psychologist. He's the author of several books. Raising Human Beings is the one that's, I think, most geared towards parent, his most recent book that's most geared towards parents, but he's got all kinds of resources out there. He developed an evidence-based model of intervention called collaborative and proactive solutions. This is an approach to problem solving with kids. And one of the key themes is that kids do well if they can. It sounds pretty simple, but it's actually quite revolutionary. I think most adults were likely raised by grown-ups who did not have that mindset. Most of us, I think, were probably raised with the idea that if kids are not doing well or not doing what we want them to, it's a matter of will. I say this as somebody who spent a lot of time training teachers. It's kind of innately in us to assume that kids are misbehaving intentionally. And so then we use rewards and consequences to try to lure them into behaving. But the research is very clear that rewards and consequences actually don't really work long term. Rewards and consequences are good for teaching right and wrong. So if your kid doesn't know the difference between right and wrong in various situations, sometimes rewarding the behavior you want or imposing a consequence to really teach a lesson can work. But most of the time, our kids do know the difference between right and wrong. And when they're not meeting our expectations, it really comes down to their ability. Dr. Greene's approach kind of reframes the philosophy around this, and he argues that all kids want to do well. And the biggest case for this is that doing well is preferable. As parents of kids with ADHD, I'm sure you have a story or two about, really negative experience your kid had when they didn't do well. If we think about how horrible it can be for kids, especially when they don't do well, when they fail to comply, when they struggle with academics or attention, when they don't meet our expectations, the world is really not set up well to deal with kids who have a hard time. When we think about that, it's really easy to appreciate that no one, especially not a kid, would willingly choose that path to fail, to not meet our expectations. If they could prevent it, they would. So it's important to kind of think about challenging or unwanted behavior, even the not stopping when you say stop, or I said no and no doesn't mean no. It's important to frame this as really a conflict between the demands that are being placed on the kid and their ability to meet the expectations. This is really the framing that I think about when working with all kids, and I actually use it with adults. I think all adults want to do well too. And I have to assume as an educator that if people aren't doing well, they just need my help learning how to do well. So that's the framing we want to take. And it's, it can be frustrating at times as a parent or as a teacher. But if we start with this base mindset that kids do well if they can, then we start to move towards solutions. This brings us to the first of our proactive strategies. Most of this talk is proactive strategies. This stream model comes right from Dr. Greene, but there are lots of experts who share a similar idea, which is simply that challenging behavior is a signal or a symptom. Just like a fever tells you that your child's immune system is fighting something, but it doesn't tell you exactly what, so you can't diagnose just based on a fever. Unwanted behaviors are a signal to you, but you won't be able to diagnose or solve that problem with those symptoms alone. So whatever the signal is, the whining, the tantrums, hitting, cursing, arguing, crying, whatever those behaviors are, I'm going to put those aside and we want to swim upstream to try to identify the expectation your child was actually having difficulty meeting before things went sour. A very simple example of this, and something we often hear in school, is about kids being disruptive in class. They're calling out, they aren't sitting in their seat, they're talking to a friend, they didn't do their work, they're not listening. This is way downstream. I don't even know what's happened. I don't know what class it is. I have no information to help me solve this problem. These behaviors are just a signal. And again, if the kid's really struggling and we believe all kids, want to do well, then no amount of rewards or consequences is going to change that behavior. So we have to swim upstream and get a better understanding of the expectations the child was actually having difficulty meeting. Then we can problem solve with that. Perhaps, the kid's sitting next to a friend, they can't see the board, there's a noise outside, there's all of these things that are making it difficult for this kid to comply in the moment. We have to get that information before we focus on the behaviors that they're exhibiting. So thinking back to my reading example, I didn't even need to problem solve with my child on that one, because once I reflected on the situation, I noticed the behavior. She was whining about reading. She was resisting reading. She was telling me that she hated reading, all of these things. These were unwanted behaviors, and I could have focused on that, but I paused and I took a step back and I realized that I had kind of created the problem. I was acting in ways that weren't exactly aligned with my values. So before even talking to her, I did a little reset to try to resolve the problem myself. And guess what? Her whining and complaining stopped. I see this a lot of times in classrooms too. Once the teachers come to me with a challenging behavior and I say, what was the expectation in that moment? Maybe they're not sure or wasn't clear, or they reflect on it and they realize, oh yeah, that's really hard for that kid. You know what, I'm going to meet with them and give them a little extra attention. Sometimes just the grown-up realizing that it's not about the behavior, it's about the thing we were asking them to do, is super important. So since we know all kids want to do well, one of the most important proactive strategies we have is to make sure everyone understands the expectations. Expectations are super important. Kids thrive in structure and clarity. Expectations are how we convey our values to our kids. They're how we tell our kids what matters to us as a family. So having expectations is not what contributes to power struggles, but having the wrong expectations might. So as adults, we really need to be able to examine why we have expectations and who they serve. Why do we have them and who do they serve? A lot of times we'll find that the expectations might be serving us as the grown-up and not really the child. Especially when you see the expectation is causing tension in your household. Who is it serving? Is it something you're just doing because your own parents expect it of you? Because other parents, expect it. I am super guilty of watching social media and I see some influencer mom do something so magical and suddenly I have this whole new chore chart, and it's not a good reason to impose an expectation. It's actually a terrible reason to impose an expectation on your child. I'm not a homesteader. My kids don't need to, pick up after chickens or whatever, but I see it on the internet. It seems like a really good idea. And suddenly I want my kids to have all the chores. That's not my family. It's not my life. I need to let go of those expectations. We should not be comparing to other parents. I think in this part of the country, especially the East Coast, Bergen County, New York City, can really always feel like a very competitive rat race. You're not doing enough for your kids, but trust me, your kids do not need expectations based on what other parents around you are doing. So that's really important. Make sure you know why you care about an expectation. What is it teaching your child? What is it conveying to them? And what is it helping them achieve? I think about this a lot when it comes to my love of family matching. I love the aesthetic of a coordinated outfit, but what is it really teaching my child? What is it telling them that we value, that we dress for other people, that looks matter more than behavior, or what's in our heart? Once I started thinking about that, I felt really guilty about family matching, but I still allow myself the guilty pleasure. I just try to communicate that it's about fun and it's about what makes us feel good as a family to have a shared identity and dress fancy, and that it's not something we do for other people. And they trust me and they believe that that's true because I also like coordinated pajamas. So this is a completely unrealistic expectation. It's bananas. It's not nearly as high stakes as the things we're all kind of, working on all the time as parents. But I think it's a good example of things that we care about as parents that mean nothing to our children. And it's always a reminder for me that a lot of times what we expect of our kids as parents, we can actually just let go. And if you just let go of the ones that don't matter, your life is going to be a lot easier. But then when you do find expectations that matter, because again, expectations are important, let's check them against typical child development. A great resource for this is the book Yardsticks by Chip Wood. It's written for teachers and it goes through every age and stage and each domain of development, and it gives you a really good idea of what to expect. Then you need to check this against your own kid and your own environment and shifting environments. All kids develop at their own pace, and we know that with ADHD, growth and development is atypical and asynchronous. So you might find it helpful to read some of these resources and books a few years behind where your kid actually is. And I also like to look ahead so I know where I'm headed. Again, if I'm doing the backwards design, I kind of need to know what are typical age appropriate expectations so I can think forward to that. And I come back to this often. I mean, I don't know how many years I've spent in grad school. I refuse to count all the years, but in all my time, I still find it helpful to go back and read some of these resources and think about what is typical, and then match it against my environment, my specific kids. And environment is important because it changes, like sometimes hour to hour. In schools, we talk about, kids have to shift from teacher to teacher to teacher, especially the older they get, which can be really hard. But, even in your own family life, if your kids are with their grandparents, or if they're overtired, or they're hangry, or they're overstimulated, some of your usual expectations might not be reasonable or fair. And you can usually tell if you start seeing some of those challenging or unwanted behaviors. And different kids respond differently. I have a child who, when hangry, we all know about it. So as soon as I see some behavior, the first thing I think about is like, has he eaten? Okay. Is he tired? You kind of have to shift and reset. Sometimes the snack can do a lot for a kid in terms of helping them reset. Sometimes it's more complicated than that, but it's really important to kind of be mindful of the environment. Another thing to ask yourself is it fair and reasonable? And this one is very hard. But I think it's important, we have to check all of our hopes and dreams for our kid against the competing expectations. I want my kids to exercise and play outside. I want them to do their homework. I want them to play an instrument. I want them to learn 2 languages. I want them to do chores and contribute to the household. I want them to express themselves creatively. I want them to be good readers, and I want them to be mathematicians and scientists and ethical citizens. And I want them to do all of that while they're wearing coordinated outfits and getting along nicely. And that might seem important to you, but it's not fair and reasonable to expect that of your kids all the time or every day. So you really have to prioritize based on what their needs are and what's realistic. And like, sure, they can learn to, play another instrument and speak another language, but like maybe not all at the same time. Or maybe don't introduce, all of these new expectations at once. You really need to kind of take your time with these things and make sure that as you're introducing new things or as you're teaching them new experiences or expectations, that you're prioritizing. I say rule of 3, no more than 3 new kind of skills, expectations they're learning at once. Sometimes I want my kids to practice their math facts and play an instrument, all of these things at once, but learning the routine of studying math facts takes time. I can't introduce that while I'm also introducing 5 other things, because it's going to be too much for them and it's going to be too much for me, and we're all being set up to fail. So I really like to prioritize no more than like 3 new expectations we're focusing on at once. Once you've winnowed down what's important, you have to be sure your child understands the expectations. Expectations have to be taught, and talking is not teaching. Although I'm spending a really long time with you tonight, mostly talking, if you recall, I asked for you to learn from reflecting on your experience, not from just hearing me talk. But for kids, especially kids with ADHD, this is super, super important. A good model for teaching is the I do, we do, you do model, where you actually walk it through with them. So I do means I do it and you watch it, so you're modeling for them. We do means we do it together. That way I can give you support and feedback. And then eventually you can do it with me supervising. And then pretty soon I don't need to supervise at all. This is, I guess a good example for this might be like brushing teeth or buckling your seatbelt. We do this for our kids for a very long time until they show some interest or ability. It's not optional, right? Like every baby gets put in a car seat, no matter how much they cry or whine. All those downstream behaviors matter not at all to us, because we know for our baby to be safe, they have to be buckled in. Same thing with brushing teeth. Nobody wants a little kid with cavities, so we all push through it. Sometimes, it's really hard, and this might be the struggle you're here to kind of troubleshoot tonight. It's certainly a common one for families, but it's not about the expectation. The expectation is non-negotiable. The kid is going in the car seat. However, first it's you doing it, and then after years and years and years of them watching you buckle, they start to grab and they try to buckle, but they can't really get it, but you encourage them to try. And then pretty soon you're standing outside the car watching them buckle, and then pretty soon you could just tell them to do it. And then sometimes, your kids get old enough and you forget to even ask them if they're buckled in the car, because you kind of know that they'll do it. You walk them through these processes, and it's not just about talking to them. So when you have an expectation for your child, make sure it's clear, but also make sure they understand how to do it. Understanding how to do it also means understanding if it's time bound or not. I think this one is really important and often overlooked, especially with kids with weaker executive functions. I have a kid who walks into her room and then I lose her, and it's like she's on her way to doing the thing, but a lot of other things are happening in between. I'm sure you've all experienced getting ready for bed, and just, it's like 1 minute you're getting ready for bed, and then it's an hour and a half later, and it's like, how does bedtime take so long? And a lot of that has to do with expectations. They all get done, but they're not necessarily time bound. So my kids can brush their teeth. They know to brush their teeth. We all know it takes 2 minutes, but I have to give them a time bound. You have 5 minutes to get this task complete. This is a normal amount of time for brushing your teeth. 2 minutes to brush, 3 minutes to do everything else. And that is really helpful, especially when time is at stake. Maybe every day, it doesn't have to be done in 5 minutes, but if I need my kid to do it quick, making it time bound is super important. Okay, so then if all of this, I say if yes, then hugs. Kids do well if they can. So if you know all above to be true, it's realistic, it's reasonable, it's fair, it's time bound, they're taught, you've seen them do the expectation a million times before, they're still not meeting the expectation, or they're asking for your help, they might just need some love. A little love and attention can go a long way in helping kids recenter themselves. I was coming down for this talk tonight, and I had a 6-year-old who was following me every step of the way. He really wanted to be a part of my evening. He's not loving the fact that I'm not doing bedtime. So eventually I just had to bring him down here and spend some time with him, help him brush his teeth, even though he can brush his teeth, give him a little, I'll help you put your jammies on tonight, because he was missing out on that time with me. He was feeling anxious and worried about that time with me. That's an adult theory. But if yes, then hugs. I gave him some extra snuggles. I told him when he could expect more snuggles. I'm going to go in when he's sleeping and give him more snuggles. And that allowed him to kind of settle down his brain and comply with the expectation that he may not come into this office the rest of the night. But if yes, then hugs, right? Things start to fall apart that we know they can do. Sometimes they just need a little bit of love. Least you think that the photos, it's a one-time thing. It's not. Once again, here to emphasize my sentiment that kids do well if they can is another image of my kids. If it isn't obvious, that is my 3-year-old pretending to urinate on the family dog. This is about 30 minutes into the photos. He had clearly lost all ability to pose for picture or behave in any civilized manner. And so he's starting to get really cheeky. And in this moment, I paused and I had to remind myself, like, this isn't really his fault. Nothing about a family photo shoot in a park is realistic, fair, developmentally appropriate. I didn't teach him what to expect. Family photos are really boring for a 3-year-old. Also, these were taken shortly after the COVID lockdown was lifted. So he hadn't actually spent any time in public or around other people. He was like literally feral at this point. So I could have gotten really frustrated with this behavior, and I could have corrected it, and I could have been embarrassed and cared what the photographer was thinking. She was laughing, thankfully. But, instead I just had to step back from this and say, you know what? Not a realistic expectation. And even his sister, you can see, like, she's aware this is not behavior we generally condone. She's not exactly surprised to see it. I think she was actually amused, but she kind of knows. And this is all to say, a path to peace is anticipate your kids are going to misbehave sometimes, and pause and ask yourself if your expectations are really very realistic. We have to appreciate, part of their development is just not meeting our expectations. And it's important not to let that affect us. I also happen to love that picture in the end. Expectations and development go hand in hand. I'm not going to review typical development because we can talk about that forever, and there's a lot of resources on this, but I do want to emphasize a few important things. One, as I said earlier, review it often. Development is asynchronous, so look back and look ahead. The other is that at each age and stage, you are shaping who your child is becoming. Decisions you make in the early stages really have the capacity to compound and build on themselves. I saw some parents in the chat with very young kids, and so the best example I have of this is screens. In early childhood, we often spend so much time present and engaged with our kids that it can feel really harmless and even necessary to give a 4 or 5-year-old a screen when we're out to dinner or we're shopping or whatever. It's a little blippy video or those videos of, hands opening toys. It seems so harmless. You're right there next to them, you know what they're viewing. But anytime you set up an expectation with a young kid, I ask you to think about, what is that going to look like in 5 or 10 years? There are some parents of older kids on here, and I bet you they would agree. A lot of time, parents, especially of like middle schoolers, tell me they wish they could extract YouTube from their child's life. They aren't sure where it got out of hand, but they wish it could stop. Or they wish their kid could sit and have a conversation with them at a table when they're out to eat. But these are family routines that are shaped over years. And if your kids are accustomed to navigating YouTube for blippy videos at 5, that's going to evolve with them. And then at 10 and 13, they're probably going to expect to have some freedom to navigate YouTube and watch whatever they want. And dialing that back, it's not impossible, but it is hard. So as much as possible, if you can, keep in mind that you're kind of always laying the foundation. So I'm not saying don't do screen with your kids, especially if you have young kids, but maybe download a video or a show or something you feel comfortable with, so there are some limits there. Because a lot of times parents allow younger children access to media they might not allow their older kid because they're there supervising it. But once you've kind of released the kid to having these devices or having access to certain apps, it's really hard to dial it back. So, you're always laying the foundation. The last thing I want to say about development is a metaphor by Dr. Lisa D'Amour. She's written several books. And in one, Untangled, she talks about parents being the pool's edge. We need to be there to catch our kids, especially teens, when they need us. So in thinking about development, the teenage years are actually really incredible years. Their interest expands, their moral thinking develops. This is where they're really forming their worldview. It's a very exciting time, but it gets a terrible rap because of this kind of emotional roller coaster that your kids are on. And I really like this model because I think it helps you kind of appreciate that teenagers are really human beings breaking out of childhood, and they're taking a plunge into the pool of adulthood. When they're swimming around, they're playing, they're having a good time, goofing off, they're trying to stay afloat. Every so often, though, they have to come to the pool's edge to hang on. When your teen is splashing in their pool, they have no time for you. You frustrate them, you're uncool, you're annoying, your rules about their phone and the party, their chores, they don't want anything to do with you. They want to be with their friends, they want to do backflips, they want to splash around. But when they're done with that, or when something goes wrong, like they run out of breath, they lose their footing, they get scared, they're going to reach for the pool's edge like it's the only thing that can save them. And as parents, especially in these adolescent years, but I think always, we really need to be there when they reach for us. And we need to be there with empathy and understanding. If you want your kid to talk to you, if you want your kid to trust you, when they finally reach out to you for support, that's not the time to have an I told you so story. It's a time to listen. Maybe like a sub note, like the path to peace in your household is adults changing their behavior. I think the second bullet note is, and listening better. Just got to listen to our kids. A lot of times your kids will turn to you and come to you, but you have to be ready to listen. And I think that's important at all stages, but I really think in adolescence, a lot of the tension, can be resolved to some degree by being available and being, not taking their emotional ups and downs as personal or an affront to you, and really thinking about how you can be there for them when they need you. I really love the pool edge metaphor. It helps me think about, the emotional brain and lack of reason that's really happening for kids. But my favorite model of this is Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. He is a clinical professor of psychiatry. Hold on. I'm just going to zoom this in for us. At the UCLA School of Medicine. And I'm going to share with you a short clip of him explaining his hand model of the brain.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up, representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
I really love this model. Kids love this model. I've taught this to middle schoolers. I've taught it to young children. And what I take away from this is really, as caregivers, our goal is to help children build and use their, metaphorical staircase between the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. It's a really great way to reflect, and apologize, point out when you flip your lid. The more you talk about this, your kids will get really, really good at bringing it back to you. One time I was starting to lose it, and my daughter grabbed my hands and sat me down on the bed and just said, "I think we're starting to have a miscommunication. Let's talk about it." And like, you want your kids to learn all these skills. It was a very humbling moment. It's a really powerful moment. Once I calmed down, I realized, like, that's pretty incredible. She was watching me start to flip my lid and she knew how to calm me down. Not her job, it's my job as the grown-up, but still, it's a great example of, our kids are watching us and they're learning from us, and these strategies really do work. Oops.
One of the
Here we go. Okay, speaking of flipping lids, nothing on earth is better at pushing a kid over the edge than their siblings. Siblings are a really, really profound part of our development, and as caregivers, we're responsible for helping to shape those relationships. And we want to shape them positively. If we follow the theme of backwards design, our siblings and our home, this is really where we learn our relationship skills. And so the way we relate to our children and teach them to relate to each other really shapes how they behave. And an important aspect of teaching our kids, and shaping these relationships, is teaching them to express their feelings without hurting each other. Our kids can have some pretty powerful and surprising reactions to our siblings, and we really do need to leave space for those bad feelings to come out in a helpful way. And this can be especially tricky when our children are wired a little bit differently. But one rule of thumb that I think is super helpful is that equal is not equal, equal is less. set the standard that fair means everyone gets what they need, and that usually doesn't mean everyone is getting the same thing. Your kids are probably very used to this from school, so it's familiar to them, I bet, but it still can be hard for kids to handle. And so you have to make time to talk with your children about their relationships and their experiences of their siblings. Kids need to get those negative feelings out. It's natural to have them, and only if they get those negative feelings out can the good feelings about their siblings come in. And even when you think things are sort of fair and your kids are well behaved and you don't perceive major sibling issues, remember that kids perceive the praise of one child as a put down of themselves. So even if everything's going fine, still, if you're praising your kids in front of each other, that might have some impact on their relationship. So whenever possible, try to praise in private or minimize this tension if you can. I really love Siblings Without Rivalry by Faber and Maslish as a resource. I like a lot of their work. But one thing that really stuck out for me from this book, it just highlights this idea that locking kids into roles can have a really lasting negative impact. I'm going to offer once again a family photo to kind of sell this point, but pretty much the entire world is going to try to label your kids and lock them into roles. And your kids will do it to each other, but you have to work really hard to resist that. I think at this point, I don't know, we've been on for 40 minutes or so. I think at this point, there's significant evidence to say that my second born is not one for family photos. Here we are, he's posing, he's looking beautifully at the camera, but only because there's a napkin on its head. At this point, his sister thinks it's hilarious and she's getting in on it. But through all these scenarios, we're talking years of wacky family photo sessions, I always make it a point not to say anything that will label him as someone who doesn't like taking pictures. And again, obviously, this is not high stakes at all, except I really do like taking family photos. And I don't think he should be instilled with this permanent trait or belief about himself that he doesn't like pictures. So on this particular day, I recall his sister saying, she made one of those always never comments, like, he's always so crazy during pictures, he never does what you ask. And anytime you hear always and never from anyone, your antennas should go up. That's your cue to intervene, because it's not always and never. And we don't want to label our kids and make them start to believe things about themselves that aren't true, because then they can't break out of it and change. So when she said that in that moment, I paused and I tried to modify, right now he's feeling silly, he's having a good time, it's okay. We want the pictures to reflect, the two of you being yourselves and having fun. It's okay if you want to get silly too. Sometimes he does pose and do what I ask, but right now the grownups are just giving suggestions. It's okay to just be yourself. Kind of diffuse in the moment. But I also made sure later that night to talk to her about it, because it kind of felt to me like that was a cue. It seems meaningless, but she was really reading unfairness, because there are different standards and expectations for him. Everywhere she goes, this is the kid who grownups expect to be reliable and do the right thing. And she's taking on that role all the time. It's completely unspoken. I've never said it to her, but she's got really good impulse control and she's compliant and she's kind of quiet. So she's taken the cue that everybody expects her to do what is asked of her at all times. And I don't think she would ever dream of putting a napkin on her head in the middle of family photos. So for her, she was struggling with these ideas of what he gets away with and what she doesn't. And we really had to talk that through. And it really helped her to air some of that. It's a lot of pressure for a kid, to be perceived as needing to meet expectations or to be perceived as never meeting them. Those are both burdens you don't want your kids to have. So, we really, more often than not, the roles our kids get locked into are way more serious than picture taker or not picture taker. Things like my good eater, my bad eater, my sleeper, my not sleeper, my helper, my athlete, my reader, my mathematician. Comparisons of any kind or labels like that are never helpful. Neither is setting up competition or using comparison or shame in comparison for compliance. It's a cheap, effective trick, and grownups do it a lot. let's race to see who can eat their peas the fastest. Or, oh, look at her. She's being so good following along. It might get the compliance you want in the moment, but it's the absolute worst thing you can do for the relationship. So one of my big backwards design hopes and dreams is that they have great relationship with each other when they're grown-ups. So I prioritize that. And even in the moment, I want to make sure that we're reflecting on that as we kind of go through our day-to-day together. Okay, simplicity. If you're feeling inundated at this point, it's okay. You probably are. I want to remind you that most of what I'm sharing, you don't have to hang on to. You just have to think about it and reflect on it more. And one thing I want you to think about is the idea of simplicity. Kim John Payne is an excellent resource for this. And really what he's telling us is that we don't need more stress. We don't need more stuff. We don't need more expectations. We really need a lot more unstructured time, a lot less stuff. So a good measure that I like to ask myself is, am I doing this out of fear or love? If I'm afraid my kid is not going to be a good athlete, so I'm doing more sports teams, that's not a good reason to do more sports teams. If I'm afraid that, my kid's not going to be able to keep themselves busy, so I buy them more toys, that's not a good reason to give them more toys. If I believe my child has a love of music and is really passionate about learning an instrument and there's time and it fits in our schedule, maybe I can give that to her. So really think about less is more. Your kids don't need more stuff to play with. The last proactive strategy, probably the most obvious, is that our kids need us. They need time with us. They need positive attention. They need love. They need attention. It's not all equal. Ask yourself, when was the last time you spent 5 minutes with your child one-on-one? Or when was the last time you spent 30 minutes without correcting their behavior or giving them feedback? Especially kids with ADHD, they get a lot more feedback than they probably need. So sometimes, again, challenging behavior is just a symptom that our kids need more. If your relationship with your child is particularly strained, parent-child interaction therapy can be really powerful. This is an approach that really structures how you relate with your child positively. It uses this acronym PRIDE, teaches you how to use positive reinforcement. It can be a powerful tool, but even PCIT Lite can make a difference. Just try to implement 5 minutes a day of special time with your child. That can have a really positive impact. If you haven't noticed, this is another family photo. In this particular scenario, by this point in my parenting journey, I recognize that family photos are not easy for us. My little guy asked to bring his baseball mitt. I said, sure. We played baseball for 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of the session. And then guess what? His bucket was full. Their smiles were not just natural, they were glowing because they were really happy. It's not about manipulating the kid for the smile, but we had this really wonderful connected moment. My kid still talks about this day. He loves these pictures because we turned it from an expectation they, were failing to meet to a fun experience for us as a family. So lean into filling their buckets and really trying to give them what they need. Okay, here we are. We're very far along and we're just starting to talk about problem solving. 50% of parenting well is proactive. The end of it is trying to respond well when things get challenging. So don't get on the conflict escalator. Expect challenging behavior. It's typical, it's age appropriate. When we expect it and we perceive it as normal, we're less likely to flip our own lid because your anger is just going to escalate the situation. So expect it and try to resist responding with anger. I like to use this strategy, this kind of visual of a stop sign. I think about reflecting, resetting, helping, and empathizing. Just like when you're on a beautiful country road, you should expect a stop sign at some point. With kids, we should expect things to go wrong. Try to reflect and remember kids do well if they can. Try to reset and remove the expectation if you can to just pause the conflict, because sometimes it's not that important. And if our kid is acting out, they're acting from a place of emotion and a flipped lid. So this isn't the moment to problem solve. If you can't let go, you have to help your kid comply. You can do that with giving two choices or actually helping them do it. And all along, you're empathizing. Helping your kid comply is a form of empathy, but also just understanding the reality. I know it's really horrible. You lost your phone for the week and you're really upset. I know it's going to be tough to communicate with your friends. You can be the imposer of the limits and also empathize. That's actually like the trick, to do it all together. One resource I really like for this, especially for younger children, is Janet Lansbury. She does have some work for older kids, but honestly, toddlers and teens are going through a lot of the same things. So I find that this is a really helpful resource when thinking about young kids, and it still kind of applies. I have a lovely video about collaborative problem solving, but it's also in the resource. So I think I'm going to skip it for now. And I'm just going to give you my own sense of what's important about this. When the same issues keep coming up over and over again, if you notice your child is continuing to have difficulty meeting expectations, then out of the moment, you can have a conversation with your child. Again, for this, I really like Dr. Greene's CPS model, but there are other similar models. One of them is Think Kids from Mass General Hospital. And I see these really as a strategy for teaching the adults to listen to children. This particular model has 3 steps. So when you do watch the video on your own time, listen for the empathy step, listen for where the adult is inviting the child to share their concerns. Listen to when the adult shares the adult concern. It's really important that nothing about a problem-solving conversation includes language about the unwanted behavior, about the whining, about the hitting, about the crying, about the whatever it is that the kid did that they weren't supposed to do. Move away from that. You really want to focus on how the unmet expectation is affecting the child or others. And then the last step is inviting the child to help you come up with a solution together. The important thing to take away from this really is that every one of these conversations is not always going to result in a crystal clear solution. But the process is what really matters. And the best example I have of that is when my own child was really young. She was 2.5 the first time I ever had a problem-solving conversation with her. And it was about getting ready for bed. It was this really kind of simple solution, which was essentially she thought that getting ready for bed was a race. She wanted to beat her infant brother in the race, so she wasn't getting ready for bed on her own. But the important part of this conversation was not the solution that we came up with. It was that she felt really in tune with me. And the way that I know she felt really in tune with me is that after we had the whole problem-solving conversation, she said to me, okay, so now that we did that, are we going to talk about why you yell at me? Because once you start listening to kids and they feel heard, they start sharing. So I tried to explain myself after I kind of responded from my sense of shock, and we talked about it. And I said, sometimes you don't listen, so I raised my voice to make sure you hear me. And she said in her little 2-year-old voice, just whisper in my ears. Sometimes even when you yell, I don't hear you because I'm playing. But if you tell me in your ears, I'll know it's important and I'll do it. And that completely transformed how we communicate. To this day, if I just kind of like come to her level and say something quietly, I'm sure she doesn't remember this conversation, but it shaped how I've communicated with her. And it makes her feel safe in telling me things, right? In that moment, she knew she could trust me. Okay, there are a series of strategies when having conversations with your child. It's really important to remain neutral. It's really important to remain reflective, respond back to them, what you're hearing them say. That feels really good all the time. So maybe do that a lot. Same thing with the who, what, where, and when. When you're in conversation with your kid, get all of those details out. But it's important not to ask your child why they're not meeting the expectation, because if they knew why, they would probably ask for help or fix it. One strategy that's super helpful in talking to your kid is why in some conditions and not others. My favorite example of this is a school example. I once had a student who was showing his work on all the hardest problems, the word problems, but not the multiple choice. Teachers thought he was just, being lazy, wanting to run through it. Turns out he didn't know how to show the work without the little lines and boxes. So he was able to be successful on the harder problems because the teacher had made those little lines and boxes for him to fill in, but on the multiple choice, they weren't there. So that's the kind of solution under one condition and not others. If you talk to a kid and you try to like give them those comparisons, they might be able to give you more information. Helping them think about what they're thinking can kind of be helpful. The other really powerful strategy for talking to your kid is breaking a situation into a component part, especially for kids with ADHD, breaking a task down into every single step. My favorite example about this one is a kid who wasn't bringing in his homework. We broke it down into every step, and what we found out was that the kid was intentionally leaving his Trapper Keeper at home because it had the school logo on it. And he was embarrassed to walk past his old public school with the logo of a specialized school. No adult could have theorized that, right? We had to listen to the kid, and it was a painful thing for him to share. So no amount of asking why was going to get us there. But when we broke it down and we talked through step by step of getting ready for school and getting that homework to school, we were able to realize that this is really not a homework problem at all. This is a self-esteem issue. We got to get this kid some support. Talk about empathy. If you're unsure where to start with problem solving, CPS has a model, a discussion guide for identifying, unsolved problems. But you can also just talk to humans in your life, make a big list of the SMART goals that you have, the expectations your kid is having difficulty meeting, and start prioritizing them. You want to focus on the ones that are really impacting safety, that are happening frequently, that are causing the greatest disruption. Those are the ones that you want to focus on first in your family. Pick a time that works for your kid and have the conversation. It's more important to pick the right time with the kid than to have the conversation. Some kids like to be snuggled up in bed and have the conversation, or at recess. Some kids find those to be really precious times and they don't want to have a hard conversation during that time. Let your kid pick the time. You sit down and you do the work of listening and responding, and let them kind of lead the way. Okay. So the last slide. This isn't everything we need to know about problem solving. I know I gave you a lot to think about. How you can connect with them, how you can problem solve. When I think about that, I really love this quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they never forget how you made them feel. I think about that with teachers and with parents and how I interact with them, but I also think it's really true of children. I don't know how many words in a lifetime you're going to say to your child, but how you make them feel when you're problem solving with them or when you're responding to those challenging behaviors is the most important part. Doesn't make any of this necessarily easier. Parenting well is hard. So we really want to heal as much as possible. Beware of distracted parenting and healing by numbing on your phone. That actually makes things worse. When we get distracted ourselves, that's really hard for our kids to feel connected to us. But at the same time, think about ways that you can play for yourself. Think about ways you can play as a family, things everybody loves to do. Invest those 5 minutes a day, make mistakes, apologize to your kiddo, ask for help for the people around you. And again, I'm going to end where we started with breathe and trust yourself. If you're here, we know you're doing the work, you're on the path, you're making the effort, you're trying things with your children. They see that, they feel that, and it does make a difference over time. I'm so grateful to be any part of that journey with your kids. I thank you for hopping on tonight. I know it's a little late, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions that we didn't get to, or if you want more information. I'm happy to be a resource to families. And again, I'm so honored and grateful to be here tonight. So thank you.
Woo!
Woo!
Oh,
Yes,
so much,
breathe.
so generous.
Thank you.
So many different things to think about. I'm taking home so many different pieces of what you said. And I love how you started with, it's not just doing it, it's really processing and integrating and thinking about these things. We're getting lots of thank yous. I don't, we usually end at 9:15. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I do see a lot of thank yous. Somebody wrote, Monica wrote, wow, I'm blown away by this model. Had me doing it while the video was playing.
Oh, the hand model.
Oh, yeah. Uh, and Eleni has put a resources link into the chat so that you don't have to quickly write things down. And if you missed any of it or you want to listen to it again, it will be posted on our website, www.bergencountychad.com. Thank you all for coming. Eleni, thank you. This was beyond expectations. It was just great. Oh, wait, more new messages.
My pleasure, my pleasure, my pleasure. Please email me if you have questions. I do want to answer any of your questions, so feel free to reach out. And you have all the resources, so you can
Do
definitely.
they know how to reach? Do they know how to get in touch with you?
Yes, Eleni at theorypractice.com, but it's also in that link that I just shared.
Okay.